So what you see here is basically the extent of the kit that I used to do the remodeling of the wiring on Chicago Crossing. And this was all researched pretty carefully before I cut the first feeder. You know, you want to make sure if you're going to actually destroy something and turn your layout into a static display, that you can turn it back into something that is functional and can run trains, and that will do a better job than what you had. You know, a lot of what you see here is exactly the same sort of stuff that folks like Larry Puckett, the DCC guy, will show you. And I think that's great. I spend a lot of time watching Larry's videos. Right now he's been rebuilding a module, and that's been useful information. The other parts of it are really just adaptations from what I've seen other folks use. Like these terminal blocks, I saw that watching the Chadwick model railroad in the UK. First off, the wire. The feeders on Chicago Crossing are all 22 gauge, and red and white are basically the two colors used. So what you see here, this is essentially just silicone wiring. And you can find this on Amazon. I'll put all the links as to what this is in the description if you want to know what it is I used precisely. But you know, this is the white 22 gauge. This is the red 22 gauge here. The original wiring on there was all solid copper wiring. This is tinned copper, and it's flexible wiring, so it's stranded wiring. The reason I decided to go with this is because if I want to make a lot of tight turns and corners and stuff like that, this is easier to do. This is 16 gauge wire, and this was basically used for the bus. And you know, similar manufacturer, similar thing. It's basically stranded tinned copper wire. So if this happens to be maybe the circulatory system of the wiring, then the terminal blocks are certainly the heart of it. And these are nice. You know, you can buy these on Amazon. They have a plastic cover, and it's all basically these type of screws where you have parallel runs of an individual circuit, and then you can place jumpers that come with it across the circuits that all use the same thing. And so this is what the jumpers that come with actually look like. It's very simple. They're just spade connections, as you can see. And for a 12 you get ones that look like this. Basically they've got a jumper full of 12. You can get other sizes, or you can just cut it down to the size that you need and insert it onto the other side. With that, of course, means you need spade connectors for the feeder wires. I used a couple of different sets of these. You buy the ones that are appropriate to the gauge of wire that you're using, and they're really quite self-explanatory. For the buses, this is a tried and true approach. It's basically just tap splices. These are tap splices that are appropriate for, I believe, between 14 and 18 gauge wire. And it's a solderless method. You put in the cable that you want to use, and you clip it down, and at that point you have a solid electrical connection that isn't going anywhere. And then lastly, and this is important because I've got a lot of splice joints that have solder, is heat shrink tubing. The last elements are really for wire dressing, and that basically constitutes keeping the wires together, trunked and in order. You can get cable ties at pretty much any hardware store. And then here, these are 1/4 inch little brackets that you can mount in order to hold the wire together. And they basically look like this. The original configuration of this layout had staples holding that stuff. You don't want to use that. These are nice, they're non-conductive. So that's about as simple as it gets. I mean, there's nothing here that is revolutionary rocket science, but it's been demonstrated over and over again in multiple layouts to be pretty bulletproof if you do it right. Much like the actual kit of things that you need in terms of supplies and consumables, the toolkit here is phenomenally simple. And wire strippers, these things are worth their weight in gold. This is just an Amazon Basics purchase. I cannot say enough how good these things are at being able to remove the insulation from wire and leave behind something that is intact. It's certainly far better than one of these type of tools. And likewise, if you're using terminal blocks and you're using spade connectors, then you need one of these. This is basically a very straightforward crimping tool for being able to crimp the connectors onto the wire. A solder station. These are little micro applicators that I use to deposit some flux onto the splice joints. Flux and then resin core solder. Those were all instrumental and used constantly. By the time I was done here, there's probably 100 solder joints sitting in there. So, hey man, good way to practice soldering, right? If it's been a while, you get good again really quick, and you make sure that you get good, hot solder joints and things like that. A little pair of scissors that was useful for clipping zip ties. Pliers like this are useful for those tap splice connectors to be able to actually push the metal piece into the wires that you're connecting. A labeler. This was important straight away because every feeder is labeled. Every block is labeled. It's important to know what is what. And so having one of these around, they're not all that expensive, is actually really helpful. And then lastly, of course, is a drill. And the important thing to note here is because I don't want to punch through the top of my layout, that'd be a horror show, I put a little piece of Kapton tape here based on how deep I wanted a pilot hole to go. There were really only, I'd say, maybe 2 signature moves that I needed in order to actually make this layout work correctly and to wire it correctly. And one of those is simply the use of those tap splicers, which again are simple. You can see explanations on these everywhere. But what it allows you to do is it allows you to have a through wire, which you see here, and then a splice wire that comes off and goes wherever the heck you want it. And these are about as simple as it gets. You literally just put the bus wire through one side. The other side terminates in a little piece of plastic here. And you essentially just press down with wire cutters or with a plier, and it causes that specific piece of metal to contact and then transmit electricity through both wires. So that way you end up having a bus wire or a bus feed that can go to a terminal block or something like that. The other part of that is simple use of these spade connectors or spade terminals. And these are simple enough to put on with a crimper. And again, for the actual 22 gauge, I would solder down through here, add a little bit of solder in order to make sure that that joint stays connected, because 22 gauge wires are really quite tiny. And then the only other signature move is essentially just wire splices. And what you see here is really just the result of what's known as the old Western Union splice. And all that is just making 2 L shapes with 2 sets of wire and then twisting them together. This is something I think Larry Puckett discussed on one of his videos, maybe even really long ago. So in this case, twisting the strands together, make an L, make another L, put them together like so, and then twist away. And so what you end up with is a pretty solid splice with a lot of contact between the 2 wires. But now that's a pretty solid connection. You can't pull it apart. And if you solder that, then now you've got something that is absolutely bulletproof. So that was used throughout the layout. Very little of this is rocket science, so to speak. I think a lot of it is simply patience and using a couple of good techniques to get you through and then making sure that when you're doing the work, that you're actually being mindful of where the wires are going and how best to actually feed them into terminal blocks and things like that.
The plan for Chicago Crossing's rewiring is really pretty simple. The layout on the underside is divided into 5 sections. Each section will get its own terminal block or set of terminal blocks depending on how many feeders are located there and what the terminal blocks will accommodate. At that point, from the DCC controller, a simple bus is run the length of the layout. From there, splice taps feed bus power into each of the terminal blocks. And the terminal blocks themselves distribute the power back to the rail feeders. The first step was stripping back the wire insulation on the pigtailed feeders where I had cut away the old wiring. This is a pretty simple task, especially given a proper stripping tool. At that point, it was a matter of attaching the terminal blocks. Keeping things straight and level? Not a bad idea. The goal here is to try to make this installation as neat as possible. On the rightmost section of the layout, I had enough feeders to actually justify a 12 terminal block for each pole. As you can see, I ended up with a different terminal block arrangement for each section of the layout, in part simply to accommodate the different number of feeders that were located there, and in other cases simply because there were obstacles in the way, like the Chicago River. On the left-hand side, there were feeders clustered in the opposite corners, and so for this, I decided to simply use 2 pairs of smaller terminal blocks. The good news is, since everything is fed into the same bus, it's easy to be flexible on these sort of arrangements. Splicing the feeders was a fairly simple task. In this case, I simply hand measured the amount of wire I would need in order to make a straightforward and sort of right angle connection into the terminal block. The idea here is to be able to measure wire lengths such that these wires can be trunked together. In other words, they're not just running askew. The goal here is to have bulletproof wiring. For these 22 gauge feeders, the spade connectors get soldered to the wire. This ensures that nothing will move and nothing will come unattached. Next up, time to splice the wires together. Here you can see I'm using the Western Union splice technique that I mentioned before. It's fairly simple. Just attach and twist. And what you end up with is a nice solid connection that's ready for soldering. There we go. You notice in the upper right, I've already attached the shrink wrap tubing, and a little bit of flux just to prep the joint for soldering. And here comes the iron. Heat up the wire, let it come to temperature, and then a bit of solder. It's not the easiest position to do this in. Unfortunately, I don't have anything to be able to clamp the wire, but with a little bit of a steady hand, it's easy enough to get a nice, solid, hot solder joint. At that point, since I already have the heat shrink tubing on there, all I need to do is straighten the wire back, slide that over, and then apply a little bit of heat from the soldering iron in order to get that shrink wrap tubing to shrink around the splice joint. And we're ready to go. At that point, the final step is simply to open up the screw on the terminal block and insert the spade connector. And now we've got a nice, tight, and as needed, serviceable joint. Well, after that, just do it about 50 to 100 more times, and then you're pretty much set. It's not always easy working in this position either. It's not quite Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel, but it's also not the most comfortable either. I'm kind of just sitting on my rear on a cushion. As I mentioned, the DCC bus itself is 16 gauge wire. That's to minimize any potential for voltage loss. You also notice that I'm twisting the wire. That is something that's recommended for DCC in order to maximize signal. And as you can see, I'm also using cable ties to help keep that twisted cable together. Splice taps are about as easy as it gets. You just have to make sure to put the splice wire on the right side. You'll notice if you don't, because you won't actually get a connection. Firm pressure with pliers all the way down will engage that metal splice, and you've got a solid connection. Last up, just flip over the little plastic latch it together, and that thing isn't going to move. Once you get it, at least. After attaching a spade connector to the bus feed, that gets run into the jumpered side of the terminal block. That makes sure that the jumpers will distribute the power through each of the terminals that need it. And the same thing on the other side for the white wire. In it goes. Easy connection, stable, and easily reworked if needed. Before bothering to clamp everything down, it's pretty important to actually just test to make sure that all of the wiring actually works. You know, there's a lot of ways to do that. I just kind of figure running a DCC sound locomotive around all of the track on the layout is probably the definitive test as to whether or not every track is getting the appropriate amount of power. I found that was so now it's time to actually dress the wires. The concept here is to try to trunk wires as closely as possible together so that there's minimal wire just running freely across the layout. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer, so I would hardly say that this is perfection. If you really want to do this well, then set up the terminal blocks such that the connections in will actually face inward. The terminal blocks are opposing each other. Here, since I don't need that many terminal blocks, I don't really do that. Instead, the goal is basically just to try to make the wiring as neat as possible, try to use right angles and corners where I can, and to make sure that everything is attached in a way that it won't move too much, won't risk being disconnected, and stays organized, because there's a lot more wiring that needs to go on top of this and around this. And of course, the definitive outcome is the ability to run trains again. Not exactly a short process. Always a reason to get it right the first time.